Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Welcome to Czechast, the podcast in English about all things Czech. In this episode, I continue my interview with Martin Palouš, a former dissident and one of the key figures in Czech diplomacy after 1989. He served as the Czech ambassador to Washington, D.C. from 2001 to 2005, and later as the Czech ambassador to the United Nations in New York. After concluding his diplomatic career, he became the director of the Václav Havel Library and then the director of the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Democracy at Florida International University. Over the past 3 decades, Martin Palouš has dedicated significant efforts to supporting Cuban dissidents and the island's opposition movements. For him, this isn't just a matter of professional diplomacy. His personal connection to the cause has shaped his outlook for decades.
You know, obviously for me it's a personal thing. I spent 30 years communicating with Cuban dissidents and democratic opposition. So some sort of solidarity is basic feeling. But I think that it is much more than solidarity with individuals. It is belief that here what is at stake is the future of democracy. We tested, I think, Havelian ideas against what I called Bermuda Triangle, European perspective, European Union perspective now, United States and Latin America.
I think Martin Palouš's approach reflects the philosophy of the Czechoslovak and then Czech president Václav Havel, the understanding that true resistance to authoritarianism starts within.
We cannot choose the place and time when we were born, but we still, under these given circumstances, have possibilities. And we all need ourselves to take this fact seriously into consideration. Václav Havel once said that who wants to fight with totalitarianism, he or she needs to first evict it from his or her own soul. You have to start fighting with yourself.
So, join me, Vít Pohanka, as I speak to Martin Palouš about his extraordinary diplomatic career, his dedication to human rights, and how the Czech experience of overcoming totalitarianism continues to inspire the pro-democracy movement on a faraway island in the Caribbean.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Here we are, I suppose, in 1991, and you are the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, yeah. Right, to Jiří Dienstbier. I'm just curious, when did the idea that then still Czechoslovakia or later Czech Republic or Czechia should join NATO? Where did the resolve, to do this come from? Because as I remember it, I was much younger, but I never thought after 1989 that we would join NATO, at least not in a foreseeable future.
Look, certainly Jiří Dienstbier, Nerda Šedivý and Luboš Dobrovský, who were running Ministry for Foreign Affairs at that moment, were rather believers in common European security, which means something based on the framework of OSCE. That obviously there were some questions in the air concerning the existing entities. It was, I think, Havel's achievement that Warsaw Alliance was dissolved. And the question was, what then about NATO? And actually I was the first Czechoslovak diplomat who visited the headquarters of NATO already in April, maybe early May of 1990. Because of Cliff Bond, who was my partner when I was Charter 77 person in Prague. He was a political officer, and I think that he had other connectivities with US government. When I was going to Leuven to talk about my studies in Belgium there, he took me to NATO headquarters. So I had interesting communication, just get acquainted with people there. So when the London summit of NATO, June 1990, produced this formula that post-communist countries or countries of our region are invited to establish diplomatic liaison. It was even not said relationship, was a very general term. When I got to a position of advisor to foreign minister, my first trip basically abroad went to Brussels, and we went again to NATO and started to ask themselves what this was all about. But then obviously it took some time before this beginning was turned into a next step. And I think the next step was coming in the fall of 1992, because it was when the concept of near abroad of Russian Federation was coined by Mr. Kozyrev, foreign minister, and the term partnership for peace as a formula for relationship between new states and NATO started to be coined. And then was a Brussels summit of NATO, and when out of sudden you had these three scenarios, three paths. One was, let's say, based on EU first, European integration first, then fill the void, stability, NATO first, and then were so-called Russia firsters, who all questions tried to reformulate from the perspective of Russia in that context. So I think that till today we have these questions around and some empirical answers. We know that the first round of NATO expansion certainly was not anything like a hostile act against the Russian Federation, but expansion of area of stability and peace. Originally it looked like that Hungary and Poland were front runners. Then thanks to Sasha von Dramen, Albright and others, Czech Republic managed to join the first round. And then you had the second round, where the NATO and EU enlargements were almost synchronous. Vilnius 10 and the first big expansion of EU. So what I'm saying is that this was a process. This was a process that tried to come up with a new political architecture, Europe, in which all these entities would play a role. But what was extremely important was that the process was not only isolated in Europe. That first in Europe you had not only unification but fragmentations. Czechoslovakia was okay, but Yugoslavia was a big...
I was just going to say, I always assumed that the war in Yugoslavia played a significant role.
Extremely important role. Till today, I think it's, I'm just looking at Kosovo situation again, and absolutely right. But the problem is that there was a process to eradicate some sort of European ideas around. But I remember during this process of NATO enlargement, I think it was Senator Lugar, who said that NATO had to go out of area or out of business. Because obviously it was Afghanistan, it was all these contra-terrorism activities, and NATO out of sudden had to rethink its own missions and out-of-area actions, not based on Article 5 of Washington Treaty, started to be very important. And obviously one of the tests that Czech Republic or other countries are ready to participate was our participation in out-of-area mission.
So it started, the process really started in, let's say, 1992. And Sasha von Dramen was definitely, this is not... he really played an important role.
Absolutely. Sasha von Dramen was ambassador in Washington in critical moment. Yeah. When it was not very clear, they were very influential members of U.S. Congress. They were not enthusiastic about the enlargement, and obviously Poland and Hungary were in certain situations. So the fact that the Czech Republic was able to jump on this train was... I think Sasha played a very important role in it.
And of course, the US is the power, but were there perhaps some European partners that needed to be, persuaded as well?
For us, obviously, the Germany and, all of them, all these big players.
And there was no kind of pushing against it, in the European context, do you think?
Obviously, Again, if you want to go back, you always had a certain tension between a transatlantic dimension of European security and European capabilities to organize European defense. And obviously now it's very clear that you can start from nuclear elements. Transatlantic dimension here is of key importance.
If we can now jump ahead a little bit, so here you are, you come to Washington DC 2001, do I remember correctly? Yeah, 2001.
Just 2 weeks after 9/11.
What was it like?
Well, I was still sitting in my office in Prague when I could see on the TV screen this
The Twin Towers
and World Trade Center and sort of that. So when I came to Washington, first of all, George W. Bush was my U.S. president. I passed my credentials to him. And the United States, for obvious reasons, were fully absorbed with that situation. So everything was heavily influenced by that. Obviously, Eric Hobsbawm said that the 20th century was short, that it ended already 1989. So then we were in the time of certain transition, but in 2001, no one could doubt that thing. And so this was, I would say, formative experience. But interesting enough, and it might be important even to take in consideration now, we are living in the moment of really very radical transition. New world, not the end of history, new phase of history, but continuity of the US policy is something that was striking between Clinton and George W. Bush, especially when it came to European security discussion. It was very significant.
That was a continuation, right?
Exactly. You know, it was this second round of NATO expansion, and it was building Europe whole and free, and all these ideas. But obviously, the biggest question, I think, as it is tragically demonstrated today, is what about Russia?
Did you have any doubts, about Russia, or in other words, did you feel them as a threat when did you see
Look, obviously for us, with Czechoslovak experience of 68, my generation, it is something that cannot be forgotten. And obviously, if you see it from a perspective of a small state finding itself in a relatively fragile space between Germany and Russia, you cannot escape these questions. So we all could hope and still hope that some sort of, let's say, Havelian ideas that small states should have or can have significant contribution, not because they have enough of power of weapons, but something else is still with us still today. So we only can believe that in spite of all these swings from one side to another, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and now Trump again, that this continuity will still be with us, but obviously, who knows?
Who knows? Yeah, we don't know. But let me share a little bit of a journalistic experience with you. 2003 summer, I'm in the kind of journalistic entourage of Prime Minister, then Vladimír Špidla. We came to Washington, D.C. There was Cyril Svoboda as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. There was Kostelka, who was then the Minister of Defense. There was the Minister of Trade and Industry. There was a big delegation, and Vladimír Špidla was in the White House, and it was a big thing. And it seemed to me at that time, to me as a journalist, that there was a kind of change, because it used to be Václav Havel who came to the White House.
Look, I happened to accompany to White House quite a number of people. And with Vladimír Špidla, I think my relationship with him still is okay, but the most difficult moment was the last days of Václav Havel's presidency, January of 2003, when Václav Havel was in Bratislava sitting in theater, and I Chavondra with him. I was in Washington, And I recommended him that he should sign that letter, New Europe versus Old Europe. It was Aznar who was...
Just for the benefit of the listeners, this was an initiative, this was a letter of the kind of new member states?
It was not a Czech initiative. I think that the initiative came from Aznar, from Spanish Prime Minister, but it was against Germany and France and...
Who were refusing to go on to
It was Iraq, I think. And so Václav Havel put his signature on that. And Václav Špidla was...
Vladimir Špidla.
Vladimir Špidla was horrified by that. He was strongly against that, but I managed to explain to him that, we till today can discuss whether all these decisions made in the spring of 2003 were good decisions because of Iraq situation. So it's what it is. But I think that it was the moment of test, whether people who might have different perspectives can, despite their differences, I would say, end or do something effective, good for the relationship. So I think that when I had the opportunity to bring Mr. Špidla to Washington, that it was okay. Vladimir Špidla, social democrat, so you can easily bring in some sort of ideological differences between right-wing economic liberals and social democrats. But I think that in the end of the day, both sides should, I would say, take into consideration Czech national interests, something that should rather unite us than bring us to the endless wars between this or that side. And I think that then Václav Havel's final decision was certainly not damaging his prestige, and the way how Mr. Špidla, in the end of the day, absorbed it speaks for him.
But was I right, to see this kind of big visit of the Czech delegation, as it must have been a diplomatic, not coup, but it was significant, wasn't it? Because how often does it happen, that you have, during your ambassadorship, was there any other such visit? With 3 ministers, 1 deputy minister, prime minister visiting White House?
No. Well,
just the protocol.
It was most likely biggest. But then had the last visit of Václav Havel to the United States, it was September 2002. That was very interesting. It was Washington, New York, and then Miami with Cubans. Then very quick, but still interesting visit of President Klaus in White House. But you are right, this was the most likely the most robust visit.
You are listening to Czechast today with Martin Palouš, former dissident, top Czech diplomat and academic.
Why I wanted to mention that, from Washington DC we went just very shortly to Norfolk, I think, to the naval base. Then we flew to Houston, and then we flew to Miami. And there was a big meeting of the Cuban exile community, which I believe you helped to organize. No, it was your initiative.
Yeah, sure, I did that. That's right.
And the reason why I bring it up, by the way, I spoke to one of Fidel Castro's daughters, was there.
Alina. Alina. Oh.
Why I mention that, you were so, I would say, crucial figure, you were so important for this Czech help to the Cuban descent and Cuban exile community. Why, for you personally, is this an important issue? I understand that it could be a whole new interview about that, but if you were to sum it up for listeners, in Czechia who perhaps don't know so much about the common history, why is it important to support Cuba? Cuban opposition, to put it like that.
I think that obviously Cuba is far away, it's island, we are a landlocked country in Central Europe. But why is Cuba important for us? I think that the fact that Cuba is dominated by family dictatorship for more than 6 decades is a strong message for those who would like to support democracies versus autocracies, who like to, through the Cuban perspective, you can understand better international relations as such. My big first involvement with Cuban situation was when I was head of Czech delegation at annual meetings of Commission for Human Rights in Geneva. In 1998, resolution speaking about state of human rights in Cuba, submitted, sponsored by the United States, was defeated because of Nelson Mandela's friendship with Fidel Castro and his fabulous play, not only East-West but North-South dimension of the world politics. It looked like that Castro won and the case was out, not anymore to be taken seriously. Next year, I was asked by Cuban dissidents, could Czech Republic willing to bring ball back to the game? We did, and we won 3 times in a row. It was because we tested, I think, Havelian ideas against what I called Bermuda Triangle, European perspective, European Union perspective now, United States and Latin America. You have 3 different historical perspectives. You can understand differences, but the question is, can you do something to win this case? So I think that winning in a Cuban case, helping Cuban Democrats finally to set the country on the path of democratization is not only important for Cubans, it would be the most important message in our global world, more interconnected with all sorts of things, IT, and we can go on and on, than anything else. So I think that, obviously for me it's a personal thing. I spent 30 years communicating with Cuban dissidents and democratic opposition, so some sort of solidarity is basic feeling. But I think that it is much more than solidarity with individuals. It is belief that here what is at stake is the future of democracy. And the world today needs a successful case of democratization. And I can guarantee to you that Cuba has the best shot. They have an economic potential because of diaspora. They are all patriots. And they have know-how, they have not the same difficult cultural, religious problems as other nations struggling for the same thing in Middle East, for instance. So Cuba, I think, is important for us.
But it doesn't look very well, does it?
Well, let's see. I think that the fact is that nothing much has changed in the past 15 years, but I think that the economic situation of Cuba is so bad today. And if you look at the levels of migration from Cuba, it also speaks for itself. I think that we can think that maybe Cuba be finding itself, let's say, in the beginning of 1989 in our context today, because they know that the old structures, East, West, North, South, are not so much helping the well-being of Cuban people, situation of Cubans, all these power outages, lack of anything, and so on and so forth. So I would be not that pessimistic. Maybe we'll be in a different situation with Cuba at the end of the next year.
After you finished in Washington, D.C., you became, or shortly afterwards, you became the Czech ambassador to the UN, to put it in simpler terms. If I may just share very briefly my personal experience with the United Nations system. In the 1990s, I worked for 3 years at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, which is just one of the agencies. And at first, I was very enthusiastic. I became international civil servant, but I became very frustrated very soon because of the bureaucracy, and I realized that for me personally, and don't take this, I understand that such agencies are important, but I felt it wasn't for me. I felt really frustrated with the bureaucracy and endless meetings. We didn't seem to lead anywhere. Of course, I wasn't a diplomat, you were a diplomat. What was your experience at the UN headquarters?
I understand your point concerning, I would say, a whole system of United Nations and multilateral diplomacy. It is first a great place for those international public servants operating there.
A lot of advantages, I have to say.
They have good salaries and
extremely good.
Absolutely. And obviously they believe that they have a strong, I would say, mission based on Charter of the United Nations and Universal Declaration and all these beautiful principles. But obviously the question is effectivity of UN system, the capability of UN system to absorb all these international processes and changes. On the one hand, it's true that we need something like public international law. You need a postal union so that deliveries are, that packages and letters are delivered. You need regulation of airspace, so on and so forth. At the same time, the beginning of United Nations in this conference in San Francisco created a system of countries that are specially responsible for international peace and security, permanent member states of Security Council with veto power, and then all other states, expansion of original number of 50-something to 192 today because of the process of decolonialization and equal sovereignty and all of that. So you can easily find the way how this international system is limping and not perfect. So you have always discussions concerning necessary reform of the United Nations. I understand skepticism, but still I believe that United Nations is an important element of multilateral diplomacy of world politics. By the way, do you know what is the budget of the United Nations in comparison to what?
I don't know. What we did at UNESCO was like a Midwestern university.
I will exactly. I think that the whole United Nations, all segments of it, there is maybe a budget comparable with larger U.S. city, not maybe Chicago, New York, but some smaller city. So what you can expect from an organization with that budget to operate on a global scale? United Nations can sometimes prevent the worst things from happening, but it hardly can be seen as, I would say, chief player, chief actor. You have always superpowers. You have an endemic U.S. problem, United States versus United Nations, let's put it that way, and so on and so forth. But still, I believe that multilateral diplomacy with all these things to be taken into consideration is important, because at least you have several United Nations. United Nations diplomats representing member states, like I was with my team, and so on and so forth. Then you have international public servants, Secretary General, and all these bodies that are operating. Then you have, let's say, United Nations, NGOs, all these non-governmental players, journalists, and so on and so forth. So I think that we need to be patient. We need to do anything possible to make United Nations a place that can. It's a mirror of the world, and our world needs mirrors.
I suppose my question would be on a more personal level. Weren't you bored after your experience with the 1990s from Czechoslovakia, with all your lifetime experience, and then coming to the United Nations as an ambassador?
Well, obviously you have to first learn the language. Not so much English only, but all these abbreviations, styles, and so on and so forth. So I found that somewhat Kafkaesque, bizarre, but still interesting, and you need to find for yourself certain role or certain place in the system. When I was there, one of the big topics discussed was R2P, responsibility to protect. Peace building commission, not only, I would say, conflict prevention, but post-conflict rehabilitation. Very exciting topic. And then how you want to combine, let's say, international law based on Charter of the United Nations and international humanitarian law. Use in bellum versus use ad bellum. Obviously, use ad bellum is Charter of the United Nations, that you are not supposed to use force otherwise than for defense purposes or with a clear mandate of the Security Council. jus in bellum is protection of civilians in armed conflicts. So now I think that we can endlessly debate Israel-Palestine, for instance, but we need United Nations at least as a point of reference so that we understand what is the problem. Humanitarian practice, protection of civilians in armed conflicts, and obviously right of Israel to act accordingly after being attacked by Hamas in October of 2023. Yeah.
Finally, you did these interviews with Paměť národa, or the Memory of Nation, 7 hours. I didn't listen to all of them, I have to say, but you mentioned several times this term, the world is a reservoir of possibilities, if I'm not quoting you wrongly.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I can only tell you what I mean by that right now, but I think that obviously for all of us, we are all free human beings and have always some possibilities, in spite of the fact that we can believe that we only can coordinate ourselves with the situation, and that is not, we cannot choose the place and time when we were born, but we still, under these given circumstances, have possibilities. And we all need ourselves to take this fact seriously into consideration. Václav Havel once said that who wants to fight with totalitarianism, he or she needs to first evict it from his or her own soul. You have to start fighting with yourself. And obviously, this type of totalitarian tendency is still with us. And the problem is capacity for coordination. When we don't take us seriously as persons who have possibilities, who don't have to do this or that, who always have to start thinking again and again. And obviously, Hannah Arendt, the most important capacity of human being is to be a new beginning, to start something new. So I think that if possibility is to start something, we should not miss that opportunity.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Czechast. I hope you enjoyed Martin Palouš's stories and insights. Please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review if you're enjoying the podcast. Next time on Czechast, I'll be talking to my longtime friend and former schoolmate Kateřina Ferenčíková-Nolasko. She grew up in Moravia, but her life took her to France, Puerto Rico, and finally Spain, where she now lives with her husband and daughter. She will share stories about adapting to different cultures and environments. One of the topics we'll discuss is her time in Puerto Rico. Here's a little preview.
For me, the hardest thing was probably maybe sexism sounds too strong, but rather the stereotypes that were valid at that time. Maybe now it has changed. I hope some things have changed, but basically people expected me as a wife of an important manager to be a full-time housewife, to be happy just to keep my house nice, have my hair done, keep my husband happy, and that was it.
You won't want to miss this conversation. Until then, take care, and I'll see you next time on Czechast. I'm Vít Pohanka signing off for Radio Prague International. Stay curious and naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.